Kia ora koutou, I'm Duncan Babbage, at the Babbage on Twitter. Maybe if someone can take a photo during the presentation and post it, it'll help me to explain to my 3 children why I left home on Father's Day to travel to Melbourne by myself. Well, perhaps like me, you rolled over out of bed at what seemed like a reasonable hour this morning, stared blearily into your iPhone to authenticate who you are, using some of that biometric information, and then swiped over to the Today view and swiped up with 2 fingers to get a preview of what your day might hold.
Today, search field, dictate, button, weather, button, heading, show more, button. Melbourne, sunny, chance of rain, 0%. Current temperature, 11 degrees. High, 20 degrees, low, 7 degrees. Batteries, heading. Phone XR, 100% charged, charging. Watch, 100% charged, charging. Calendar, button, heading, show more, button. Hammer drop at World's Greatest Dev Conference from 9:45 a.m. to 10:15 a.m. Duncan Babbage, button. Kiwi Bank balances, button, heading, show less, button. Anvil Restoration Fund, rent and groceries, edit, button.
Well, it feels like I've got an overview of my day, although I'm not sure with those bank balances there. It told me that I've got my Anvil Restoration Fund account still open and I've got my rent and power, but I wonder, without any further information there, whether I'm accurately sort of dividing my funds between these 2 activities. What does it mean to be a disabled person? Being a disabled person is nothing to do with the particular collection of physical bodily structures that a person has. To be a disabled person is to be a person who lives in a society that has created an environment that doesn't let particular individuals participate fully in that society. People are disabled by their environments that we choose to create. Environments that for some people enable them to be full participants in the things that we value, while for other people, just by virtue of a particular collection of bodily structures, we say, you are going to be disabled by us. For a person whose particular collection of bodily structures, it means that they get information about their environment primarily through their hearing rather than through sight. If we don't support technologies like VoiceOver on the iPhone, we are disabling them. People who have impaired vision, who are blind or who have partial sight are perfectly capable of using the same information technology devices as anybody else, as long as we don't choose to disable them. But when we don't fully implement technologies like VoiceOver, such as on that Today view from the Kiwi Bank app, My Bank, where it states the bank account names, but it doesn't actually correctly give the values that are displayed to a sighted user, a person is disabled as surely as if part of their inner ear itself was missing. When we support VoiceOver and we actually complete that circuit from the information that we hold through these technologies to send the signal to a person's brain, they are no longer disabled anymore. Now, the most important thing, if you are wanting to work with people who have been disabled by their environment, is to actually talk to those people themselves about what they want and what they need. And so I went to the Apple Viz community, an online community that is specifically focused on supporting people with partial vision or without vision to use Apple technologies, particularly macOS and iOS technologies. And it's a very active community. And I said to them, tell me about near misses in support for VoiceOver, apps that incorporate VoiceOver but haven't got it quite right. And tell me about great experiences that you've had. And I also asked them, what do you wish developers knew? I said, I'm coming to the Dev World conference. I asked this question last week and I said, what do you want people to know next week in your voice? And so I'm going to tell you some of the things that people from that community said. Greg G, who's a VoiceOver user, said, when designing an app, Show the developers with VoiceOver on. Flick and double tap and have them try it and listen to what is spoken by VoiceOver. Now, we get a lot for free in the Apple technologies, but you can't provide a great VoiceOver experience without actually trying out how your app works in VoiceOver and understanding what it is supposed to do. But when you first turn on VoiceOver and start trying to use it, my experience was one of increasing confusion. I lived in an ignorance is bliss kind of world before this, but as I started to look at VoiceOver, what I realized was that in contrast to something like visual design or support for dynamic type, where you can see pretty quickly if something looks good or if it looks broken, with VoiceOver I realized I wasn't sure what counted as a good experience. And also, although I could see, okay, it's reading words out on the screen and it puts a box around them as it does so, and if I swiped left and right, I could move that box around, I didn't really understand how VoiceOver works. So tip 0, we're all developers here, right? So we're going to start counting at 0. Tip 0 is learn the core VoiceOver gestures, and you're not going to figure them out without some tutorials. So I'd like to recommend 2 apps to you. The Looktel VoiceOver tutorial app is the one that I use to learn how to use VoiceOver. It was recommended to me by a friend who works for the New Zealand Foundation for the Blind as a trainer, and she is a VoiceOver user. She's a blind woman herself. Now this app actually is not currently available in the App Store. All of Looktel's apps disappeared some weeks ago, and there's been some consternation in the AppleViz community about what has happened. So I reached out to them and asked what was going on and encouraged them to release it as open source if they weren't planning on supporting it any further. They assure me the app is coming back, but it hadn't arrived when I last checked. It seems they're having some issues with their developer account, one of the problems of being an organization within a much larger set of partner organizations, I think. So another app which I haven't used fully myself, but which is well recommended, is called VO Starter, and also it provides a tutorial to teach you some of the less obvious gestures and opportunities for how to use VoiceOver. Very useful start. Tip 2, oh that should have been tip 1, is immerse yourself. Restrict your vision and learn VoiceOver patterns by using other apps. Now, you don't necessarily need to go all method actor like I did and get an eye infection in both eyes to keep your eyes closed. You may simply want to use a blindfold. But when I did have this eye infection recently and I spent longer using VoiceOver without looking back at the screen, what I found is that that persistence through confusion is really valuable. I tried to do quite a lot on my iPhone, more than I had in the past on other people's apps. And one of the things that I realized from that is that you learn more about VoiceOver by using other people's apps than you do by testing your own. Because the problem with apps that we've developed ourselves is that you can never actually step back from your understanding of the overall structure of the app. You know when you hit a tap target what is going to appear next. And therefore, you're never going to be as confused as you should be by the VoiceOver experience that your app provides. But even another app that you use regularly, we're never as familiar with its internal structures because we're just used to seeing things appear on the screen and respond to them. And I was amazed at how quickly I became confused by some of the other apps that I use normally when I tried to use them in VoiceOver. Tip 3, use concise labels. Lisette Chaprione, maybe, I apologize if I've pronounced her name incorrectly, who's a VoiceOver user and was also one of the blog team at AppleViz, said the best labels state exactly what the control does, giving as much information as possible in as few words as possible. Consider using new document rather than create new document, or options instead of open options menu. Shorter labels increase productivity for Braille users, in particular, who have very limited space on their displays. A typical way that a VoiceOver user will use an app that they've used previously is to quickly flick through controls until they find the one they want. So it's very important that the first one word, and certainly the first couple of words, orient them to which control is currently selected so that they can move on, rather than having to listen to the full detail of a longer label when they are just looking for something that they know is already coming. The set continues. As an example of poor button labeling, in the Kindle app, the control that before the last major update was quite sensibly called Return to Book is now called Book Actions Menu, Exit Button. This is confusing because it would be quite easy to hear Book Actions Menu and think it will open a new menu, or hear Exit Button and think it will close the book. Compared to the old label, it has more words but less information. My fourth tip is go with the flow. One of the things I wondered when I was trying to support VoiceOver better in my own apps was, should I control the order in which VoiceOver reads things out in order to provide a more optimized experience that gets to the important things first? The answer is no. Don't even think about this. Now, perhaps with some of the latest SwiftUI technologies, there are ways to slightly influence the order here. But this is very advanced sort of supporting VoiceOver decisions that you might make, and generally you are not going to want to do this. Actually, the spatial relationship between what is being read out and what is displayed on the screen matters to VoiceOver users. Because even some VoiceOver users are actually still able to see their screens, but VoiceOver helps them to fully understand the information that is presented. But even for someone who is fully blind, they still need to be able to use the spatial relationship between controls on the screen and what is being read out by VoiceOver to find a control they want to get to quickly once they know all the things that are on the screen. If VoiceOver was reading things out in a random order, then all they would know is the collection of everything is on the screen, but no idea what's at the top and what might be near the bottom. So the good news is, don't worry about this. Lay out the controls in a way that makes sense for all your users, and that's going to be the way that makes sense for VoiceOver users. Now, when you listen to your app in VoiceOver on a particular screen, you can swipe up with 2 fingers and it will read all the controls from top left to bottom right on the screen. Very useful. Or tap on one control and swipe down with 2 fingers to read all the controls from that point down the screen. You might say, there's some bits of this that just don't make any sense. There's a little collection of items here where it's reading out delete, advance, highlight, before it tells me what the content actually is. How do I know those things are related? Well, there's a much better tip than changing the order of that, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. DPinWI, a VoiceOver user on the forum, said, I use AmbleApp as an interface with our local shared ride taxi service. When booking a ride, sometimes the done button, for example, the date input, is above the picker, and then on the next screen for time input, it is below the picker. Having it in one place would make it easier to find and the use of the app more efficient. Now, this is just within one app, but it also applies across apps as much as possible. So tip number 5 is stick to standards and common patterns. Unlocking the iPhone from the lock screen, if Face ID isn't working for you or you've chosen not to use it, is a little bit different than using other UI buttons in the iOS interface with VoiceOver. On the lock screen passcode, you can simply drag your finger across the passcode buttons and it voices which the different button is. And when you find the one you want, you lift up your finger and that number is selected. So that way, it is faster. It also perhaps provides a greater degree of security for the person using VoiceOver if they are allowing their phone to audibly read these out rather than using earbuds like AirPods or something like that. I'm not sure if that's why Apple did this, but they did. They must be using some black magic to achieve this, because this is not something that's possible with UI buttons. So Apple have done something special. Once I'd learned this, I felt quite comfortable with it. But then one of the things I was doing that day I had that eye infection and my eyes were still closed was I decided to try and change the passcode on my phone because I wanted to record some VoiceOver videos on my phone, potentially for this presentation, and I didn't want to have the same passcode that I would be using once I got to the conference. And so I went into settings and I found the passcode option and I said, open passcode settings. And the first thing that the iPhone does, of course, is it asks you to enter your passcode before you can view your passcode settings. And so I got exactly the same kind of audio prompt as it gives me at the lock screen, enter your passcode. And I wish I'd been recording at this time, because for a comically long period of time, I was dragging around the screen, trying to find the buttons, and I just couldn't find them. I've been to this screen many times before. Eventually I swiped up with 2 fingers and it read out everything on the screen, and it told me there was a 1 button, a 2 button, a 3 button, a 4 button. I'm like, yeah, they're all there. I am on the screen I think I'm on. And I started dragging around again, but I still couldn't find them because I was assuming they were in the middle of my screen as I'd become accustomed at the lock screen. But actually Apple uses the number keyboard, which appears at the bottom of the screen for some reason. But this is not voiced in any way. Eventually I found this and I was able to use it. And because it's a keyboard, it works like the lock screen. When you drag a finger to a letter or a number, it reads it out. When you let up on a particular letter, that one is confirmed. So you don't have to do what you would normally do with the UI button, which is highlight it and then double tap on your screen somewhere to say, yes, I want to activate this button. In contrast, the KiwiBank app also prompts you for a PIN code when you enter, but understandably, they've built their PIN code using UI buttons. So here, their layout is almost the same as the lock screen, although it's moved just enough up that probably motor memory means I would always miss initially, maybe never realize it's different if I didn't have vision. But in this case, you have to select the item, and then because it's a button, you have to double tap somewhere on the screen to select each item. So again, I spent a comically long amount of time trying to enter passcodes and not understanding why I wasn't getting through to the information I needed because it was different. This really underscored for me how easy it is for things that are similar but different to be confusing using a VoiceOver interface. Now, for a VoiceOver user, of course, if they regularly use each of these screens, they will learn the differences. But you're increasing cognitive load considerably if you're expecting that a person is going to do something in your app that is very similar and standard, but you've done it in a non-standard way. Deepin Wee says again, one of my personal pet peeves that is an example of something that is accessible but could be better is when buttons or settings are double labeled. Many apps will have one text string followed by a button that can toggle, but some apps first say the label and then repeat it again as part of the actual button. It's not a big deal, and it's better than no label, but it bugs me. This is actually a symptom of that getting things for free with the VoiceOver support. Essentially, all iOS apps have VoiceOver support. It's just a question of how bad your VoiceOver support is. There's no such thing as not having VoiceOver support. You may just be providing an experience that you would find embarrassing if you realized what it was delivering. And one of the things you get for free is that UI labels are read out and that UI buttons are read out with the name of the button and then it says button afterwards. So never add the word button to your label or it will say delete button button. So what you want to do to avoid this when you have assemblages of labels and buttons is to create a single target for voice control when there is a single logical target. So this is an example from the menu screen of my own app intro, before and after some changes I made around a year ago to provide better VoiceOver support. So this is what it was like based on the you get it for free and you haven't actually done anything about it kind of stage.
Intro demo, intro logo, image, bookmarks, button. Bookmarks. People you've marked for quick access, dimmed. Search, button. Search. Find a person, group or note, dimmed. Learn. Learn names and faces, dimmed. New, button. New. Create a person, dimmed. Settings, button. Help, button. Support, button. Settings. Help. Support.
Now those last three would be particularly confusing. And you also notice there that the Learn button actually wasn't accessible to VoiceOver at all, only the label and the hint were. Now because I'd added a gesture recognizer to the label, which still activated the button, this was actually accessible via an accessibility label. And so even though I was using UI tests that were activating this button, I didn't realize that the touch target that you had to find in order to access this was much smaller if you were using VoiceOver than if you were not. So what would you do with this? Well, it's pretty obvious.
Intro,
really.
bookmarks, button, search, button, learn, button, new, button, settings, button, help, button, support, button,
But we don't have to stop
support,
those hints
button,
from being unavailable to people.
help, button, settings, button, new, button, create a person, learn, button, learn names and faces, search, button, find a person, group or note, bookmarks, button, people you've marked for quick access,
The VoiceOver accessibility framework has the accessibility label that you set, but it also has something called an accessibility hint. And the accessibility hint is something that's read out if a person puts the VoiceOver target onto an item and leaves it there for a second or so. So VoiceOver pauses and then it reads out the accessibility hint. If a person moves on quickly, they never have to hear the VoiceOver accessibility hints. And so it's a great way of providing more context that might be required for your labels, but doing it in a way where you're not adding extra separate VoiceOver controls that are not actually or actionable. You can likewise set a value for a VoiceOver control. And so what this means is if you have something like on that Today view where you have, a bank account and the bank account balance, you can set the bank account balance as the value. And again, it won't be a separate swipe target, but it will be read out with that control. Or you could, of course, in that case, just simply build that into what you set as the accessibility label in the first place. Now, the reason why there's not very much code in this presentation is because actually the code for supporting VoiceOver well is extremely trivial. It's not difficult at all. Once you've got your head around what a good VoiceOver experience is like, it's extremely easy to do well. Here is the code that would be required to set that accessibility label and the accessibility hint on that bookmarks button, and then to simply label is accessibility element equals false for the other two items that I don't want to be voiced any longer because they're now redundant. You can also do this in Interface Builder if you would rather set it there. It works exactly the same either way. Tip number 7, and this is probably the next stage of leveling up. If you've worked out to make sure that the right things are accessible to VoiceOver, that the wrong things are not voiced when they shouldn't be, and that you don't have things that are actually hidden on screen but still read out by VoiceOver, which unfortunately is all too common when you're doing clever things with opaque layers but not testing it in VoiceOver, is to implement custom actions. Tip number 7 is custom actions are easy and they're great. Now Apple uses this, for instance, on the screen for adding widgets to that Today view. That as you swipe right to move down the screen, it reads out each of those rows, weather, batteries, stocks, and then it also reads out the drag indicator on the right. But when you pause on one of these for the first time, it will say actions available. And for someone who is a VoiceOver user, they know that that means there's additional actions, sort of like when you swipe on a table view row and you get additional buttons, that the person has available to them to act on that particular item. And to access those, you simply swipe up or down on the screen while that is the current focus. So when Siri App Suggestions is the current focus, if I swipe up, the first thing it will say is remove. The next thing it will say is move up. And the next thing it will say is move down. And then I double tap on the screen when I get to the action I want, and it completes that. Now this is a great way of building together a combination of perhaps buttons that are visible to a sighted user into custom actions that appear on one consolidated VoiceOver item for your users. This is also particularly useful for people who use switch control for their iPhones or other devices, where the same accessibility technology frameworks are feeding into how the switch control operates. And Apple has a good video example where the use of custom actions took it from being 18 taps on a switch control to complete a particular action down to 6. That's obviously great for users. Apple have a short video from this year's WWDC, making apps more accessible with custom actions, and this code example is from there. This is all that has to be done to implement custom actions in your app. Roxanne Pollard, a VoiceOver user, said, when a developer is going to add VoiceOver to their app, I would think that they would know whether or not VoiceOver actually works as they expect it to before ever releasing the app. If they cannot use it with someone with the VoiceOver active, how would someone without sight be expected to interact with the app? So a couple of things to help you with this are tip 8, use the accessibility inspector. Now, in light of the limited 25 minutes I had available to do this presentation today, Apple were kind enough to put together a video for you on the accessibility inspector, and it's available at this link here. I encourage you to use it. And likewise, tip 9 is use UI tests to guarantee VoiceOver labels exist and can be used. This won't guarantee a good VoiceOver experience, but it will guarantee at least a bad VoiceOver experience can work. Now, whether you use Apple's UI testing framework or something like KIF, the Keep It Functional framework, which was explicitly designed with these kind of objectives in mind, it'll help avoid this kind of situation like Karen P told me about, the Uber app, which is generally accessible to VoiceOver. But when you've got a car on the way, the Communicate with Driver button does not have a VoiceOver label and cannot be reached by VoiceOver users. Probably the people who most need to use that functionality. Tip number 10, VoiceOver code has local effects. Implementing it in one part of your app doesn't affect anything else. And so it's much easier than something like dynamic type, which might break your design. VoiceOver won't break your design, and in fact, how you implement VoiceOver on one screen only has relevance to other screens in terms of you wanting to be consistent. So add it as you build your app, but also if you find VoiceOver problems while working on something else, just fix them in passing, because there aren't going to be any problematic flow-on effects elsewhere, and the reality is that doing these things progressively, it's more likely you'll actually get the job done. So finally, tip 11 is check out voice control in iOS 13. It's kind of magical. It works incredibly well. If you put good VoiceOver labels on your app, then voice control is probably going to work without you taking any steps at all. And there are 3 ways that people can use voice control. They can have controls numbered, or they can have controls labeled using your VoiceOver labels. The one place where voice control may not work super well for your users is if you've used custom controls that iOS doesn't recognize as UI buttons that are actionable, where they may not have these kind of labels or numbers, and instead what you'll have to do is use the grid controls. This is also a good way to discover places like I had here in my settings where I accidentally still hadn't labeled a button correctly. Although all I'm going to say about that is I'm in quite good company in that regard. Final tip in my last minute, tip 12, everything is easy in SwiftUI. In SwiftUI, Apple have gone even further to try and let you get VoiceOver accessibility for free, even on custom controls. It works very well, and it has specific techniques for assisting you in that consolidation of multiple controls into a single VoiceOver target as well. So again, there's a good video on this to learn more. Talk to and learn from end users really is the most important tip, and it's where I'm going to leave you. Learn about accessibility, and if your users come to you and say they have an issue related to that, respond and work with them. I think you should tell them about this site, AppleViz, and I think you should take a look at the Weather Gods, an app, and explain the story of this app to developers next week, and about how the app wasn't accessible at first, and how active the dev is on here. This is a prime example of accessibility and response and feedback. And Brian said, I wish there was one chat messaging app designed for Braille use. Using most messaging apps in Braille is awful. Usually we must limit it to one other chatter and a very slow message rate. It really affects people's lives when our tools are not accessible. Kai summed it up beautifully, I think. When you forget and neglect those, without any and all sight, you're creating a huge divide and making us feel like no one cares and we don't matter one bit. Please keep all of this in mind when it comes to VoiceOver. Thanks so much. Thank you.